Hello. My name is Adams Bodomo. I have been asked to talk about translation, and translation is very crucial in situations where you have more than one language. So whenever you have two languages or more, and people communicate, people are bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, and there's this kind of communication going on, invariably is often the need to translate one language to the other. So translation is a process in which people convert meaning from one language, a source language, to another, a target language. So there are several aspects of translation. They usually in very oral situations, like for example in a court where there's simultaneous translation, when we talk about an interpretation of matter. So whenever it is oral or on the go, the one we have to talk about interpretation. But whenever we do text translation converting text from one source language to the other, then we talk of translation proper. But there are, of course, various aspects of translation. You can have translation in the technical sense. Even biologically, there's a term called translation, which deals with DNA and transformation. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about language. And there are several aspects of translation. You can have a technical translation, you can have, business translations. But what we are going to look at today is the literary translation. Translation is very important for us, or for situations where people write in different languages, and then there are audiences that do not understand the languages in which the literary work is produced, and now have to be talked to about that book or that literary aspect. So in the case of Africa, where we have a multiplicity of languages, there is the need to bring in translation. Literary translation is a pursuit of literary work in its own right. One can even say it's a genre in its own right, because without the translator, much of the work that happens in many parts of the world would not be available for other people. So in the African context, where we have a situation in which people write mostly in the former colonial languages, English, French, and Portuguese, which are often claimed to be our national languages or official languages, we need to translate not just among each other, like from English to French, or from French to English, English to Portuguese, Portuguese to English, Portuguese to French, and French to Portuguese. Not only should we be doing this, we should actually be translating these texts into African languages. It's very important. But more importantly, translating African language texts or literary works in African language into other languages of international dimensions, like, for example, English, French, and Portuguese. But not only just these three, but also other languages like German, Japanese, Chinese. We expect to expand African literature. And when I talk about African literature, I'm talking about the real African literature, which is a literature in African languages. To expand African literature, we need to translate these works in our languages, from Swahili, from Hausa, from Yoruba, from Dagari, from Akan, from Ewe, from Zulu, from Amharic, from all the languages of Africa into languages of international dimensions. So that's one view about it. So literary translation is very important for the literary scholar in the African perspective, and also not just in the African perspective, but in all other perspectives, whether we're talking about Asia or Latin America or even Europe, literary translation is a very important, pursuit in its own right. Now, the question is, how do I, as a scholar, what is my approach to this? As a scholar, as somebody that is trained in linguistics and literature and other fields in the humanities, I am very interested in the question of translation. Throughout my work, I have always thought that one should ensure that works that are produced in one language are available for a larger audience in another language. And so therefore, I have what I call a theory of parallel texts. So parallel text, what's a parallel text? A parallel text is a two or more texts placed together that translate, that show text in one language. So for example, if I write a poem in Dagar, which is my mother tongue, if I write a short story in Hausa, I want to be sure that that short story is available in another language, say English or French, but also it's available in other African languages. So if we see a text, a literary poem in Hausa or a poem in Swahili, we want to see the same version of the translation of the poem in another language, like English, French, Swahili, Zulu, Ewe, Yoruba, Wolof, More, Dabane, Kusal, in any of these languages. So a parallel text then is that kind of thing, a pair where we try to translate the meanings from one source language into a target language. A parallel text is also not just, we could also try to look at, to be as close as possible to the syntax of the language, or to the structure of the language, to have it in the target language. What have I done in parallel text? I've done a publication already in the journal, a quite known journal called Translation, a transdisciplinary journal, in which I explained my idea of parallel text, and I actually translated two of my poems. A poem about the death of Mandela, our African icon. Another poem about the Chibok girls, the capture of the Chibok girls, in which I write them in Dagari and I parallel text them into English. Another thing I'm doing as part of my parallel text, I've just finished parallel texting about 50 folk tales, written first in Dagari and then parallel texted into English. So a colleague of mine, my uncle Mark Ali, and I are just about publishing this text. It's coming out in the next 1 or 2 months. It's completed. So this is just basically my own approach so far, and there's still more to come. Now, let me say a few things about my work with Gelada. Gelada is a very important platform for illustrating how important translation is in the African context. In that Gelada thing, Gelada did something very important. It took a short story by renowned professor, renowned African literary scholar, Professor Ngugi, the Upright Revolution, and made sure that it has been translated into many African languages. And one of the translations is by me, my uncle and I, Mark Ali and Adams Bodomo, translating this short story into Dagari, which is the language of Ghana and Burkina Faso. That's my first contribution to this important platform called Gelada. The next thing is that I also invited to pursue this further. I invited Professor Ngugi, who I admire very much and who I always want every year. I hope that he can win the Nobel Prize. I invited Professor Ngugi. He agreed. We're very honored when he agreed to come to us in May 2017 to give a talk, but also to do what? To witness our exhibiting the upright revolution. So we had an exhibition of the upright revolution where we selected various translations and put them on the walls in our department. And at that event, Professor Ngugi was there, and Moses Kilolo, who is an editor, one of the editors of the Gelada. So I think that it's one of the, probably the first and maybe even the only such exhibition of this important work. I think more departments of African studies, of linguistics, of literature should actually be exhibiting this this translation of the upright revolution. Very important thing. And so I could continue to talk about translation, but I think I need to summarize. I need to conclude and to say that translation is a very important aspect if we want to promote African language literature, which I call Afriphone literature. If we want to promote our literature in our African languages, we need to take translation seriously. Now, why? Because one reason being that there is this vexatious question of access, of market, accessibility. Actually, I get very much annoyed about this because people say that, well, because there's not much market in writing literature in a small African language, or even in the bigger African languages like Yoruba, Swahili, Igbo, or something, that we should be actually be writing now in English or French, where there is much market. I think this is complete nonsense, because these cultures went through several years and created their own market. I think we should also create our own market, by writing in these languages. And but for now, one of the things translation can help us do is to solve this problem, or to address this issue of accessibility of market, is to actually translate works written in our languages into languages of wider communication, like English, French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, and so on. But we also hope that scholars from the other aspects will also translate African languages into their languages. So it is important to understand that translation is very important. It is a pursuit in it's a literary pursuit in itself. If you have a translator, translators are very important. Literary translators are very important for us scholars who want to promote literature in African languages. Thank you very much.
My name is Mukoma Wangui. I'm an associate professor of English in the newly renamed department. Before it was the English department, we renamed it to Literatures in English. And in a way that relates to what I'll be talking about here today, which is translation, and having different literatures meet through translation, right? Translation as a democratic space where languages can meet on an equal footing, right? So in translation, ideally, in the same way we say all human beings are equal, you can make the argument that all languages are equal. Though, of course, to go back to Animal Farm, some languages then are treated as more equal than others, right? So we have to think of translation in the larger question of definitely the language question, the question of African languages, the role colonial education played in how in having us inherit, especially my generation born in the 1970s, inherit a very condescending attitude towards African languages, right? So, but then of course that also comes with the material consequences, right? So it's not just a question of psychologically recognizing our languages. They have been deprived of resources. actually as one of the co-founders of the Mabati Cornell Kiswahili Prize for African Writing, I've gotten to see just how, I keep saying it's almost like having a front row seat where you can see the damage that has been done to African languages, right? So just broadly speaking, Kiswahili is spoken by less than 200 million people, and yet there are only 2 literary prizes as far as I know, right? In Gikuyu, my mother tongue, they are absolutely, they are not writing prizes, right? There was a journal that was started by my father, Gogwadi, I think it's online now, but I think it's also defunct. But anyway, considering such a large population of Gikuyu speakers, right, and not to have literary journals, not to have prizes and so on and so forth, really does speak to how the material conditions of African languages are very poor. Or Hausa, for example, right? Or Yoruba, how many Yoruba literary prizes are there, right? So in other words, when we're thinking about translation, we have to think about the larger question of African languages, the colonial havoc done to African languages by colonialism. Then they inherited almost maybe a double consciousness, right? if you could call it that, an inherited double consciousness, where on the one hand, we can speak, with friends and so on and so forth in Gikuyu, in my case, but then turn to our children, and speak to them in English and so on and so forth, right? So maybe, but of course I'm here to talk about translation, so let me get to that. So the way I see it, there are 3 types of translation, right? There's translating from European languages into African languages, right? And there's also translating from African languages to European languages, other languages for that matter, could be Russian or Chinese, and then translating amongst African languages, right? So first, a lot of translation hasn't been done, right? From European languages to African languages, right? So a lot of that hasn't been done. And certainly a lot less has been done about translating from African languages into European languages, right? And much less, and much less translating amongst African languages. And I believe that, especially for scholars and younger scholars, the real innovation will come when they start translating, and thinking about translation amongst African languages, right? Most of the theorizing work that has been done using European or Western concepts of translation. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's a question of the missed opportunities, right? For example, if I'm translating from English to Kiswahili, right, I'll have a different set of concerns than if I'm translating from, say, Xhosa or Isizulu, and translating that into Gikuyu or Kiswahili, right? And part of it is the rhythm itself, right? The rhythm will be different, right? I won't have to worry about rhyme schemes and so on and so forth. At the same time, I don't have to worry too much about translating, history, right? I think it's Nabokov who said that when he translates with a footnote of a mountain of footnotes, right? In order to give historical context and so on and so forth. But if you're translating between languages that share a common history, in this case, let's say a common history of colonialism, then that will require for a different set of theoretical concerns, right? So the young African scholars can ask themselves, are they better off using Western translation theories, or actually coming up with theories that are looking at translating between African languages, right? And a good place to start would be to look at the Gelada project, the Gelada translation project. I think now it's very close to 100 stories have been translated, if not by now 100. And and most of the stories were translated between or amongst African languages, right? So a young scholar could start from there and say, what is different from African literary translation theory and Western? What's the difference between the two, right? At the same time, I do think as scholars we need to do more work using using African philosophical concepts, which mostly you'll find in African languages. The example I like to give is of Itueka, right, which in Gikuyu means break, but it also means revolution. Right? It's something that was invoked by they're called Bariako. It's essentially the beginnings of the Mau Mau, right? And this was where, according to Gikuyu, I guess Gikuyu political systems, the youth could invoke Itueka or call for a Itueka ceremony when things have become so bad that there really needs to be a change in terms of leadership, right? It's essentially a generational handoff. So then are you better off using Itueka to read, let's say, Gogewadi, A Grain of Wheat, which is dealing with the Mau Mau, the revolution, and so on and so forth? Or are you better off than using, as a lot of people do, Marxist terms, which I have no problem with. I come from post-colonial theory, right? So I don't have a problem with using Marxism to read African literature, but I think it's when we do it at the expense of concepts, that African languages, to put it badly, have kindly given us, right? To give you another example, take the concept of a bhikkhu, right, which is, if you're interested in this, you can read Wole Soyinka's the fourth stage, right, where he's talking about a bhikkhu. Yeah, but a bhikkhu is the concept of return, the child who is born, dies, and then keeps coming back, and so on and so forth. So again, are we better off using, I don't know, theories, let's say, hybridity and so on and so forth, to read, let's say, Toni Morrison's Beloved, right? Or are we better off using a bhikkhu, right, which is a concept that's talking about awesome transition, to read Beloved or Wole Soyinka's books and so on and so forth, right, or other African books. Yeah, so young scholars do have a lot of translation soul searching to do. Now, part of it, of course, is employment, right? I remember I once talked about using a bhikkhu, or Itueka, to read African literature, and this was at an ALA, an African Literature Association conference, and people just laughed because it sounded so ridiculous that would give up, hybridity, cosmopolitan, this and that, and they would give that up and use African concepts, right? Meaning that those same profs, if they're in a hiring committee, surely won't consider seriously candidates who are saying, I'm using Itueka to read the works of Gogewadi or Achebe, and so on and so forth, or Amata Idu, right? So and another thing we can do then when we think about translation is to think about how our languages can be in conversation, not just with European languages, but languages from all over, Telugu, for example, right? So languages that have also faced marginalization, right? Where you also have writers who are working in those languages, right? We need to have that sort of, Pan-African, Afro-Asiatic, I don't know how to put it. We need to have Global South translation theories, right? In other words, how does, let's say, novels from Kenya speak to novels, let's say, from Cuba, written in Spanish, and so on and so forth. But really, ultimately, translation, we have to see it within the larger question of African languages, right? Meaning that we cannot remove the question of translation, right? We cannot remove the question of translation from the larger struggle for African languages. I've already given you an example of how poorly the African languages are doing, right? But consider African languages being taught in schools, right? If you write in an African language, will you get a publisher, right? And if you get a publisher, will they have the mechanism, to sell the books? Okay, so if you think of it, you can think of translation as part of the African literary ecosystem, right? So it's an ecosystem then that involves, of course, the writers, the editors. We need, we need literary agents who work with African languages. But I say that also aware that even English itself, right, is not doing it's not doing that well, right? I don't mean in terms of the number of speaking it, but I mean in terms of the material support or part of it, or let's say the English literary ecosystem in Africa, right? Where you could count the amount of prizes in English, for example, and I doubt you can get to 100. If you think of Africa as having close to 1 billion people now, right? How many literary prizes do we need? How many journals do we need? How many publishers do we need, and so on and so forth, to create this literary ecosystem? Yeah, so I also wanted to add the importance of scholars out in the field who go out and research to also translate some of their scholarly findings in the languages, right, from those people that they're researching. So for example, when I was growing up, we'd be sent out to go get folk stories, from our grandparents, and then of course we would write them in English, right? So in a way it's as if we are emptying. Or again, it's not a fair relationship, because then whatever knowledge you would find, we wouldn't take it back to the people. So, and this is quite common for us, especially for people who are doing their PhDs, right? Where they go, they get their quote unquote, their native informant, they do the interviews, and then whatever knowledge they generate ends up being locked in English, right? As opposed to also thinking that part of their scholarly moral obligation is also to have their findings be shared by the people whom they are studying, right? So I do suppose scholars have to do a lot of soul searching and find how they want to use translation as a way of sharing knowledge and as a way of creating democratic relationships between different languages. Yeah, so I would say really, I would just go back to and keep stressing the idea of thinking in terms of translation as part of the literary ecosystem, right? With the Mabati Prize, it's been very difficult. We have people who want to translate, but we don't have the finances, right? So I guess another question that we can ask as I close is, what's the role of African philanthropy in developing these literary ecosystems? When we were studying the Mabati Prize, we went to a Western donor, who pretty much donates for a lot of things that have to do with the African literature. But he outrightly said no, he cannot sponsor anything to do with Kiswahili because he doesn't speak the language. Well, then we said, okay, maybe it's not so much about speaking the language. We are thinking about, you could sponsor the translation, right? And of course there was no follow-up, right? Meaning that it would be sort of ridiculous for us to expect Western donors, right, who themselves are part of what else I've talked about as the English metaphysical, the role of oh, now I've lost my point. Thanks to Moses, who is who just but at any rate, yeah. So even English isn't the English literary ecosystem isn't doing very well. Then what's the role of African philanthropy when it comes to to growing African literature in African languages, right? So I do think that's something we need to push as writers and as other people in the literary ecosystem, African philanthropy for African cultural development. Then Moses is asking me to talk about the role of the digital space in promoting African languages. And I would say Gelada really captures the innovativeness, right, that the digital space has provided, right? So the short story written by Bodomo called "The Upright Revolution," translated into close to 100 languages, where if you go to the Gelada website, you'll find the stories. They're also audio, right? So it does provide a democratic space for all these languages to live. Though at the same time, I would say we have to be conscious also of access, to the internet, right? Are we going to replicate the sort of elitism, that came with traditional publishing, right? Or are we going to use the digital space for it to be democratic, where people in rural areas, for example, will have access to, let's say, the Gelada example, right? So we also have to be conscious of the digital divide and find ways of certainly not making it any worse, or find innovative solutions. I mean, the stories are audio, right? You know, so maybe, you know, you could have, I don't know, I'm just throwing these ideas out there now, but you could have, I don't know, CDs or whatever, you know, that will make it more accessible to people. Yeah, but certainly I would say translation to end. Translation is the future, right? The translation is the future of all languages. That's how they'll meet. That's how African languages will get knowledge wealth from other languages, right? So you can think of when we translate only from African languages into English, for example, we are actually taking knowledge out from African languages, right, and feeding it into English, right? So we need to do it. We need to do it the other way around. You know, we need to translate from as many languages as possible into our languages, so they can, so that they can grow. Yeah, so I think that's it from my end. I look forward to listening to everybody else, and thank you, Gelada, for organizing this.
Hello, it's Wangui Goro here. I'm very delighted to be invited to this session by Gelada, looking at the issue of translation, which is my hobby horse, and looking at the impact of scholarly endeavor in this field in the African context. Of course, as everybody knows, the question of translation has gained greater attention since Ngugi's Wathiongo's great moment when he said he would no longer write in Kikuyu, in English, but would be writing in his mother tongue. This is not to say that African languages have not been written about for a very long time, or indeed that translation in the African context has not been going on for a very long time. As we know, the early scripts and writing, such as hieroglyphics and other different forms of writing, have been prevalent in Africa for a very long time, as have our oral traditions, which usually cross borders because people live next to each other's communities. And whether it's tacit or indirect translation, the stories travel and have traveled far and wide, as we know, through translation and interpretation, especially through intermarriage, through trade, and through all kinds of communication. And since our communities, our oral tradition, operate in the oral tradition, then we can expect naturally that there's nothing new about translation in Africa. This was amplified during the colonial period by, of course, the colonial encounter where the European languages were forced on African people, and also with interactions with such people such as Arab traders, Chinese traders in the earlier centuries, and a whole trade and mobility around the Indian Ocean, with excursions through slave trade and slavery. So we can see that languages have gone beyond the realms of the African continent and spawned new languages in the Caribbean, in the United States, in Canada, where people have migrated, and then back in different directions. So we can assume that the African translation spans a global cultures and communities. We also know that there was great encounters with people from Asia, particularly from India and the Middle East. So fast forward to the post-Ngugi moment, which I call the cultural turn, and which I actually attribute to Professor Chinua Achebe on translation to Masisi Kunene, as well as others. Saji Bachman, who had been taken as a specimen from Africa to Europe, spoke French, English, and Dutch. And this is not recorded in the scholarship about translation. But she was an interpreter and a translator, and that's partly how we know her story. So I personally became involved in translation studies after I translated, many, many years after I had translated Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Matigari. And it was through a moment of epiphany for me, because I was studying European languages in Europe. And we were required for translation to work in our mother tongue. or our first European language. And of course, my first language was not a European language. I was very challenged because I would have had to offer English as my first language, and it made me very sad and shocked. This was around 1980. So it was an illumination for me personally, struggling with this dilemma of offering English as my first language. When I was able to hear articulated this issue by Ngugi on the primacy of our languages, although I must say that I already knew this because my family always insisted that we had to speak our mother tongue as well as learn other languages. Our nation has a national language, which is Swahili. So it wasn't such a big thing, but I did not speak Swahili. I'd never written or studied Kikuyu other than as an oral language. So it was a moment of revelation for me, and I was very delighted. So when I finished the degree, I was able to go home and was able to translate Ngugi's children's stories as well as Matigari. And then that led me to the scholarship. And the degree in translation studies at Middlesex University was the first degree that was offered in the UK, and it had a great impact even on translation studies in other parts of the world, including in the United States of America. It was a pioneering degree. We offered a master's degree, and I was the first PhD student on that program, and I was also teaching on it. And we had some of the world's largest scholars come to teach or talk to our students because the texts didn't exist then in translation, literary translation studies. So you'll have heard names such as Lawrence Venuti and so many others, Louise von Flutto. So many scholars of translation came who have published and gone on to become expert scholars in the field. But what are the implications for African studies? There's still very few scholarly studies in African literary translation, but translation activity is going on. I founded a number of associations to create a culture and ecology of translation so that we could have scholarship emerging rather than writing futuristic essays. So we had translation caucus of the African Studies Association, which is heading towards its 20th year. And there have been many other endeavors, many panels at many conferences on translation studies. But what really has been the most important thing is that people have been translating books and encountering the challenges in the African languages of translation, whether it's in Yoruba, such as with Pam Smith, Madeleine Deyega, translating French to English, myself translating Kikuyu, Kiswahili, French, and Italian into Kikuyu, and vice versa. So we're learning what the issues are in each of the languages because no one size fits all. And we've also tried to form other associations on the continent. We have an association of translators, Subtitles and Dubbing, which I chair and which I found, which tries to bring together people so that they can share their experiences in their translation challenges. And hopefully that there's more scholarship coming out, more articles. So far, haven't seen too many full-length books by African writers. And I encourage the translators to publish more, even if it's in anthologies or full edited work. I should say my own PhD was on Ngugi's work because that was what I was familiar with. I did a scholarly study of Devil on the Cross and Matigari, the translations of. And of course, I was one of the translators, and I did it deliberately because I had kept a journal when I was translating Matigari, just to share the difficulty with myself, and then be available for the world. So there is a Translation Studies Association now in Africa, but it's not a literary translation studies. And there is a journal now that's in existence and an association, as well as the Altruist, which is the Association of Literary Translators, Subtitling and Dubbing. And we hope that the community will grow. And we're watching the space. I myself curate translations, and of course you've seen the very important work that Gelada has done, and the magnificent story that has crashed boundaries across the world with Ngugi's story, which has been translated into so many languages. So that translation issue is really critical. And what have we to say about the new generation? I'm very excited that the baton has been passed on and that the young people are themselves interested in this endeavor. More importantly, I'm happy because they're going to keep the languages alive. We were worried that the languages may die with the coming generation, but we're very excited that this keen excitement and the global exchange, which is exciting the space that other people are interested in our work, in our languages. My dream, of course, is to see Africa to Africa translation. I'm very excited to see the people right across the continent translating each other's works. There's more PhDs being published in mother tongue, more monographs. So I think this space is bound to grow. So I'm very excited at this juncture, and I'm changing gears as well to amplify the actual promotion of the languages. Because if we don't do it, they will die. And I'm excited that ACALAN, which is the African Union's official body for the promotion of African languages, has launched an Africa Week in January. And I hope that you'll be hearing more about this, and that they will promote Kiswahili for Africa as a real living matter rather than an aspiration. So you'll hear more about this soon, and I hope that that will lead to many more translations. And I also hope that the technology will help us to leapfrog the manuscript. And I'm very thankful that I have this opportunity to have this conversation. I thank you very much. Thank you.